My father was a minister of the Christian church, and so I was born in Oregon, where mom and dad had both done college in Eugene. I was born in Myrtle Point.
So you had the Portland Blazers jersey?
Oh, yeah. Well, but because they're the closest professional basketball team. But also because, yes, I'm a loyal Oregonian. We moved to Indiana for Dad to do grad school at the seminary in Indianapolis.
What seminary was that?
What's that?
What seminary was that?
It's just called Christian Theological Seminary. It's at Butler University.
Okay.
And I was, I think, 9 months old when we moved there. I don't have many memories of that. The first parsonage that we lived in was actually a converted chicken coop. And I have allergies to a number of pollens. And when I was in residency, I told the allergist that I had started out life in a converted chicken coop, and he just shuddered.
Yeah, I don't think they allow that today.
That's correct. They would not allow that today. But in rural Indiana in the 1950s, that was apparently okay. So I lived my first 4.5 years at one location about 40 miles south of Indianapolis, and then we moved to what was technically in Indianapolis. It was an address of Indianapolis, but it was rural, northwest corner.
Growing up as well?
Yeah. My brother was born just before we made the move from Bluff Creek, the first church, to Traders Point, the second church in Indiana. And then my sister was born when we lived at the Traders Point location. And so I grew up next to cornfields. We had an acre of garden. I hated weeding, but I did it, and made my nose run. But I did it because it was how we ate. And so...
Do you look back on it fondly now?
Yes. Definitely.
Obviously, during the time, maybe not super fun.
No, it was for the most part, it was fun. It was a small, tight-knit community. Most everybody I went to school with went to our church. And so kind of my whole life was in that community, and I got to know people of all ages pretty well.
Let me pause you there for a second.
Yeah.
Because I think one thing we are missing today in society as a whole is that culture of community.
Correct.
One thing you mentioned was you had your school friends, your church friends, but they were all kind of the same. But then you also had friends from different age levels. So it wasn't just your age, but also adults, probably grandparents.
Correct.
And I look at culture today, and I don't see that happening as much.
Right. And I think the church is one of the last institutions in our society where it is possible to know people of all ages and get to know them fairly well. And so in that way, it's kind of a shame that more people don't attend a church, take their children to church. It's not just about knowing the Old Testament questions on Jeopardy. It's about having that sense of community supporting you, watching you grow and develop as a child into adulthood. So
for people, because I think you make a good point, for people who aren't religious, how else would someone else get that community, you think?
That's tough. PTA pretty much striated by age. I suppose if you got involved in your local library system, and volunteered at the library, you might have a chance to get to know people of different ages. I've actually thought a lot about that. But beyond that, there really aren't many structures in society that allow us to do that. I suppose if you found the right kind of volunteer organization, maybe my daughter, for instance, has worked with the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And
you have to very much go out of your way to create that community for yourself or your family if you want to do that. Or a religious group, institution, it's more natural. It's built in.
Correct.
Everyone's there kind of for each other.
That's right. I think, there really isn't much else. I mean, you get into a volunteer situation like working for a food bank, You're working mostly with retired people.
Right.
Now, there's a lot of value in talking with retired people. I myself am a retired people. But the reality is there just isn't much in society that allows people all of those ages to get to know.
One thing I do, this was kind of where this podcast was birthed, was in a sauna. Because in the sauna, I had the opportunity to talk to people from all walks of life. Whoever, it was kind of like my mini office.
Right.
I never knew who would come in, and I would talk to someone 20 years. I had to talk to someone 50.
Right.
And I would talk to people in their 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And I was like, where else would I be able to do this? Where people are willing to, and they're shorter conversations. So I just made the deliberate choice to not do small talk. It's very easy to be like, did you watch the game last night? But I would get right into it. And people would tell me all sorts of crazy stuff. Like, I just got divorced, or I was cheating on my wife, or just the craziest stuff that, where else would someone tell me these intimate things outside of this? I was like, I don't know where if you're at a coffee shop, people aren't going to just randomly have conversation with you. So the sauna was a way for me to be like, hey, this is actually kind of fun. How can I get this in a longer format? Right. And so some of my initial guests were people I met in the sauna. And then being a member at the Y, I met, Jim and some of those people. But outside of that, because I talk to young men today, and I just tell them a little bit about the things that I do. And like, hey, you can do them too. But it's like, you have to put yourself out there. It's not just, you don't naturally just interact with people.
It takes effort.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember being a little bit saddened in the 1980s when the first children's toothpaste came out, and thinking to myself, wow, our society is striating by age to the point that parents and kids can't use the same toothpaste. Well, I guess some families, they still do. But it was just telling to me that society was starting to go, when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, nobody labeled us. Well, let me think about that. Did they? Yeah, I guess they called us the baby boomers, the post-war World War II baby boomers. But this business of identifying every generation by 15 or 20 year spans seems kind of odd to me. Because, again, people are just people.
Yeah.
And you don't know in your 20s what you know in your 60s, but maybe you haven't made the same mistakes in your 20s that you have made in your 60s either. So, I mean, there's good and bad for both ways.
Again, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and one of the ones I listen to, they're talking about the grandmother effect. Where, as you mentioned, there's such a separation from different age groups.
Right.
Where the grandmother effect is like, if you look at the human body, and it's like, once you can no longer reproduce outside of human beings, usually that animal dies because they have no more purpose. But in humans, we actually continue to live even if we can no longer reproduce.
Right.
And so they believe a part of that is because having kids is so hard, women should be interacting with older women so that they can help give advice. But because there's so much separation, you have all these mothers in their 20s and 30s. Who are they getting advice from? From other 20 and 30-year-olds.
Right.
Where you really should be getting advice from 40, 50, 60, 70-year-olds.
Correct.
But because there's so much separation, they all just keep making the same silly mistakes. Where it's like, hey, you don't necessarily have to talk to your grandma or your mom because you may not have that relationship, but at least talk to someone that's already been there, done that.
Correct.
And it can kind of put to bed some of the controversies or debates.
Let me add to your comment that a lot of people get their information from the internet, which again may be correct, may not be correct. There's no insistence on truth on the internet, as you well know. And so, I found in my professional career, I was often fighting misinformation coming from the internet. But anyway, to go back to my life story, we lived in Indiana until I was almost 13. And then we moved to Beaverton, Oregon, which at that time had trees and grass and, wasn't just all pavement like it is now. And I loved it there. It was great. I could ride my bicycle for 6-8 miles, go see friends after school, be home in time for dinner. And it was a wonderful life. I got heavily involved in music, and by the time I was in high school, I was in 5 different musical groups. My mother used to rant and rave that I was never home, but I was, in rehearsals for different things all the time. I was in the musicals in high school, like a lot of kids are. And then I decided I wanted to try the East Coast for college, just to see that culture.
Can I pause you for a second?
Yes.
So a really pivotal time in people's lives is ending of high school.
Yes.
Becoming an adult.
Yes.
Did you know at 17, 18, 19 what you want to do with your life?
Yes.
So let's talk into that phase, and then we'll go to college.
I'd actually known since I was 4 years old that I wanted to be a doctor. So, and I really struggled in college with medicine or music. And I decided there was no way to be an amateur doctor, but I could be a real doctor and be an amateur musician, within the context of the church, almost a semi-pro musician. And so that allowed me the most options. And I guess all through my life, I've always made the decision that gives me more options.
That's a good one. That's a really good framework. Because again, I think a lot of people, I don't know if it's all young people or just if every generation goes through the same thing, but they struggle with making a decision.
Yes.
They don't make a decision. And it sounds like your framework was you had decisions you had to make, but you would make it knowing that it would just give you more opportunities later.
Right.
Did you have someone help you think through that decision that you made to become a doctor?
No.
Or you just kind of sat down and thought through it? And
Right. I sat down, pros, cons, on a piece of paper, and looked at all the options. I don't know if they even had this when you were in high school, but you remember that there was a great big book that listed all the colleges in America.
Yeah.
My counselor in high school let me take that home the summer after my sophomore year because she knew it was just going to sit in the office. Nobody was going to be using it. So I read through the whole thing, listed 256 schools that looked interesting, and then cut that down to 128, and then to 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2. And I applied to 2 colleges and got into both of them. So
something else you brought up that I think is interesting is, so I grew up as an athlete, personally. That was things I always geared towards. My mom tried to get me in piano. I went through series 1 with 3 different teachers, and they all realized, like, this is not him. I didn't like it. They didn't like it. It's just like, this is just not the thing. But I do want to talk to you. I think there's value for a kid to figure out how to get good at something.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be sports. That's just the path that I've taken, and now that's the path my boys are most likely taking.
Yes.
I think my daughter wants to learn a thing, and so we'll try to get into piano. But I think it's very valuable for a child to get good at something, because then that can translate to something as they get older. Correct. Where I look at children today who aren't good at anything, maybe video games, and it's very hard for them to translate that skill
into real life.
So that is. Were you interested in sports at all growing up, or is it really just the music?
Yeah, I was on the tennis team in high school and college, and I guess I really wanted to become a Renaissance woman, with the right brain and the left brain, both working together. That seemed to me to be the best balance for my life and for being relevant to my patients. So that's kind of what I always strived for.
Yeah, there's another podcaster I listen to, Dr. Gad Saad. Have you heard of him? Dr. Gad Saad.
Okay.
Saad, I think. And he said, so he's a professor, and he said the issue with a lot of people who get good at one thing is that they only get good at one thing.
Right.
And he finds it, people are more interesting if they can get really good at multiple things. Like you said, I'm not only good at music, but I'm also a good doctor, but I also can do sports. And so as a society now, we want people to hyper-focus on one thing. And I think it's really cool that you got good at a lot of different things.
Well, yeah. Actually, I was nominated for a Rhodes Scholarship. And the problem was in the 1970s, women were not allowed to have Rhodes Scholarships. It was only for men. They changed it the next year after we challenged.
Nice.
My college president and I went to a meeting in Philadelphia and really pushed that idea. And the next year they changed it, and women can now have a Rhodes Scholarship.
Nice.
Yeah. So
was there a particular reason why at 4 you wanted to become a doctor? Did you have an experience with a doctor, or that was just set in your mind?
Actually, to tell you the truth, we lived in the country, as I said. We were surrounded by cornfields, and right in a corner of the fence, one of the local farmers, had a sow that was ready to deliver piglets, and he put her right there in the corner where I could watch everything that went on. And it was watching those baby pigs being born. I said, wow, I want to be a doctor. I want to know about all of that and how the human body works.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and for some people, I don't know, and I haven't done the research, how many people know from a young age what they want to do, if that's a smaller percentage. It is helpful if you have that goal in mind from a young age to know.
Yeah.
But I think that's more of the exception than the norm.
Correct.
It is helpful if from a young age you know. But yeah, at some point it is helpful to have a goal to work towards.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And not everybody, has a goal at 4 years of age. Right. I do understand that. It was kind of interesting. I went, as I said, I went to college in the Philadelphia area because I wanted to experience the East Coast culture. And then I went to Case Western Reserve, which is in Cleveland, Ohio, for medical school. That was a bit of a sacrifice itself. Because Cleveland was, those were the years when the Cuyahoga River would catch on fire because it was so polluted. Anyway, things in Cleveland have gotten a lot better since then, as I understand it. The Cavaliers have helped that. Anyway.
So you're an NBA fan?
Just a little bit.
You're aware of what's
Yeah, I'm aware. Yeah. I'm really a Seahawks fan. I enjoy watching the strategy of football. But anyway, so I went to Cleveland. I was there for 4 years. I met and married a guy from my class. He was an Ohio boy. He wanted to stay fairly close to his parents. And so we went to Cincinnati. My first choice would have been here in Seattle because my parents lived in Edmonds. But the way the match worked, it was his highest and my highest that were the same city. That's how the match worked at that point in time. I think it may still do that for married couples. But anyway, we ended up in Cincinnati. So I did the residency in pediatric medicine at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital.
Is there a particular reason you chose that field?
Pediatrics? Honestly, I flipped a coin between pediatrics and family practice. And it came up peds. The coin did. And looking at the whole situation, my husband wanted to go into family practice. And I thought, maybe better if I'm not competing with him.
Yeah.
And also, I realized that I wanted to know more in depth about a field rather than family practice, which is a smattering of many fields. So I was happy with my choice for pediatrics, but I did actually flip the coin to make that decision.
Some decisions in life, there isn't a wrong one.
Correct.
And so you can leave it to chance, or you can leave it to, you may not always know. Because people, sometimes if you talk to young people, like, well, how'd you know? It's like, sometimes you don't know.
You don't know.
And sometimes people are so worried about making the wrong decision that it's like,
yeah.
Especially if you're a Christian, it's like, well, which university should I go to? Which one does God want me to go to? It's like, it doesn't really matter because you can go to anyone and still have a good experience.
It's just being who you are once you're there. So anyway, we were in Cincinnati for 5 years. I did a 3-year residency, and then I did a 2-year fellowship in pediatric emergency medicine. And then we moved out to the Seattle area and bought a house in Woodinville. And
at what point do you get the DR status? So you
at the end of your 4 years of med school.
So you do 4 years of bachelor's.
Yeah.
And it can be any field.
Right.
But most people do something usually medical related.
I did anthropology.
So you don't have to necessarily. So you could go 4 years of college and not really do
a pre-med.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are usually 5 courses that are required for getting into med school. And so if you can do those around another major, again, I think it broadens your perspective if you have a social science or even English lit or, French or Italian or something else that's non-medical at all. It gives you a background from which to converse with your patients later on.
So for let's say a young gal or guy that's listening to this and they're thinking about the medical field, what would kind of be your advice? Take the pre-med or
I would major in something else and do the courses that you need around. Baby biology, baby chemistry, baby physics, calculus, and organic chemistry. Those are the 5 requirements to get into med school. And you can easily do those in 4 years.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting.
Yeah. So I think it just makes you a broader, more interesting person if you major in something else.
Well, I wasn't planning on getting into this part of the conversation, but let's talk about college as a whole.
Okay.
I believe when you went to college made sense.
Yes.
It wasn't super expensive.
It was not super expensive.
It did cost. You did have to put some effort in.
Right.
You weren't coming out with a ridiculous amount of debt.
Correct.
And I think... And I do like the idea of going to college. And to me, the theory of college was being exposed to teachers, being exposed to other students, and then being exposed to other information that you wouldn't have. That's the theory of college, is you're being exposed to all this stuff. So we're not necessarily telling you what to think, but we're telling you how to think.
That's correct.
That, to me, is the theory and goal of college.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think that's quite the case anymore. And so when I talk to older people I went to college, I have a bachelor's, I have 2 masters, so I'm not the guy that's like, college is bad, but then never went. It's like, no, I did go to college, and the experience that I had was, it's not worth it. Unless you are going to go into a specific field like what you did to become a doctor.
Yeah.
But a lot of these kids are going in and getting just the most silliest degrees.
Yeah.
And they're actually not learning anything.
Correct.
And then like my buddy, he actually is he got his PhD as he's a doctor in the academia world. Like he studied this one particular plant super well, and it's like, so you're really knowledgeable of that plant, but what does it do for society? And he's like, nothing. I was like, cool. But
it does enhance the field of knowledge for humankind.
Yes. Yeah. But so he's a college professor, and I'm like, are these kids learning stuff? And are they having a relationship with you? He's like, not really.
Wow.
Well, I'm sure when you went to college, you probably had somewhat of a relationship with your professors.
Oh, yes.
So you had engaging relationships.
I did work study. I transcribed an anthropology professor's field notes.
Where he's not having that. And a lot of it is, if it's a male teacher, they don't even want to come across. They don't really want to engage with female students.
Yeah.
They don't want to have that whole tension.
That threat.
And with the whole online thing, he's like, dude, I don't have a relationship with my students. Not because he doesn't want to. It's just not how it's set up.
Right.
So if we define college differently today than it is in the past, then I think people can understand it's not the same thing. College that you went to, college that I went to, which was even 15 years ago, is very different than the college today.
Yeah.
And now I wouldn't necessarily encourage everyone to go to college.
Right.
Because you're not getting what the theory of it was 50 years ago.
You just need to learn critical thinking skills at some point.
Yes.
And if you can do that, well, you remember the movie Good Will Hunting, where he, says for $1.50 library card, you can learn everything to a guy in the bar. And that's absolutely true. If people have that mental discipline to be able to learn critical thinking skills. But if they don't learn critical thinking skills in high school, one would hope that they'd learn it in college or, I have a friend who works for King County Metro. He's a mechanic, and he works on keeping the buses running. It was clear to me through several conversations that his thinking about the politics of the day was largely influenced by the other guys he works with in the shop. And I mean, that's fine to an extent, but I don't know that he ever really analyzed what was being said and what direction a couple of people in the shop were pushing everybody
so let me ask
in their
this.
thinking.
Like, we've never had a relationship before.
No, that's right.
And part of this is to show that, like, you can have engaging conversations with strangers.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure there's areas that we may not agree on, and that's totally okay.
Yeah.
But I love the fact that you're hitting on this critical thinking. And it's like, this is me thinking out loud, because we homeschool our kids.
Okay.
And we made that choice because we knew that no one is going to love our kids more than we are.
Correct.
We made them. We have the opportunity to do that, and so we want to do that for our kids.
Yeah.
But one of the things I want to make sure we do is we teach them how to think critically.
Yes.
Of course, when they're young, we're teaching them what to think. But then as they get older, and I think that's one thing a lot of people are missing out on is critical thinking skills. Yes. Because today, if I meet someone with a certain hair color, I already know 99% about that person. I know exactly where you're going to land on all these positions. Where if someone meets me, they're not going to know every position that I'm on. Right. And because you should have nuance in different positions. Right. But the biggest thing is, how do we get people to become critical thinkers? Is that more innate, or can that somehow be taught?
It's taught.
What do you think?
I think it's taught.
Yeah. But why are so many people not have that skill?
I think that's been a failure of the education system in America for a long time. Was that
more normal back when you were going through high school and college?
I think so. I think it was memorization was largely encouraged. We had to memorize the first stanza of the Canterbury Tales, in Middle English. And what good does that do me now? Right. I have a refrigerator magnet that says, "I'm so glad that I learned in high school math how to do parallelograms because it comes in so handy during parallelogram season." Right. Meaning rather than taxes, how to do my taxes. Yeah. Well, taxes aren't necessarily critical thinking either, but the point is, at some point in your life, you need to be able to sort out what's the right thing to do if you're going to have a moral compass of any kind. And that may mean that you're not thinking exactly the same way 6 other people in your group of friends are thinking, but it's still important to go there. I wish we had more high-level politicians, and that's all I'll say, who understood critical thinking skills and had them. Right. So, I think that's extremely important. On top of that, as I said, I chose to go to the East Coast because I knew it was a different culture from the Pacific Northwest, different culture from Indiana, farm country, and I wanted to experience that. So I was taking in all of these little nuances of the East Coast sort of intelligentsia culture at the same time I was learning.
I think a lot of people, they like to stick to a bubble.
Yeah.
And then we call it the echo chamber, especially if it's online with the algorithm that's feeding you. And you have to get out of that.
Yeah.
Or I'm not even registered, but I would consider myself an independent. which then forces you to have to think through different situations, because I don't have to necessarily align with one group or another.
Right.
It's like, no, I just want to research this. And then ideally, maybe we'll get into this later, but ideally, I'm never going to be an expert in everything.
Right.
So that's why we rely on experts like a doctor to then tell us. But then how do you know that doctor isn't ideologically captured in one way or another? Or the sales guy? So we need subject matter experts in different fields, but you're just hoping that subject matter expert is a critical thinker and isn't going to be captured by what. So it gets
correct.
We need to rely on experts.
Yeah.
But then it becomes dangerous when the experts are no longer critical thinkers in that particular field.
Right. Now, the culture of medicine certainly encourages critical thinking because you learn new bits of information from scientific studies that come out. And so you want to be able to analyze those and say, was this really a well-designed study? Does this really tell me what the authors of this paper think they're telling me? So, yeah, I think medicine is a great field for that because it encourages scientific thinking all the way along.
Yeah.
And yes, I think religion and science can go hand in hand.
Yes. Yeah. So another thing that caught my interest was you chose to get married at a young age.
24.
Which is young compared to where a lot of people today have been taught, wait till you get all your degrees, wait till you finish your doctorate program.
Right.
And now you would have been in like late 20s, early 30s.
Correct.
Where back then, I think society more and less encouraged. It's okay to get married young. You don't have to have all your ducks in a row. Right.
We got married at 24. We didn't have a child till we were 29 because we had a lot of years of training still. I actually had our daughter at the end of residency and then did my 2-year fellowship after that. And then we made the move back to the Pacific Northwest.
Were there any... During that training, is there anything that stuck out to you or any highlight moments, especially if someone is interested in that career? Is there, again, that's not a field that I'm very knowledgeable about, but just moments that stand out, or was there any defining things that occurred during that time?
Oh,
obviously,
golly.
you have to learn, you got to learn the stuff.
There is so much that you learn in your residency after you've finished the book learning. Then you figure out, okay, this is really the field that I've entered, and do I want to stay there? When you decide, yes, I do want to stay there, then it's a matter of soaking up all the information that you possibly can. The good news is the way medical training in this country is designed, you hear the same information many, many times. It's repetitive, almost to the point of boredom at times, but it's good reminder. And as I always taught students, because I was also a professor at University of Washington and the Wazoo, the new Wazoo Medical School.
That's why you're so good at speaking. You're very articulate.
What's that?
You're very articulate.
Oh. Oh, I hope so. As I told them, if you can completely explain something to someone else who doesn't know it already, then you really know the subject.
Right.
If you cannot explain the different types of anemia to a set of parents when you discover that their child has anemia, then you don't know it. So make sure that you can articulate it yourself. And I taught that to med students and residents. How
long were you professor?
Well, golly, I'm a professor emeritus now because I retired, but when we moved to the Pacific Northwest, I went to a job at Harborview. I took care of all the kids in the burn unit and the trauma unit there. I had residents from Children's Hospital come over to Harborview and stay with us for a 4-month period of time, and they learned more about burns and surgery and emergency care because we oversaw the care of all the children who were at Harborview.
So again, you don't know anything about me, but I dipped my toe in the medical field. I was a medic in the Army.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, maybe I'll become a nurse or a PAs to do thing because you don't have to do all the work a doctor does. And so I did have to go work at Harborview. We did sessions there, and then we were able to go visit all the burn unit.
Yeah.
After that, I was like, yeah, that's not for me. But I'm glad I did it because it's like, hey, you try different things and then you realize what you like or don't like. And I realized, yeah, I just don't really have an interest in doing this. And I'm glad there's people out there that do. But one of the things that struck me was, if you're a caretaker, how do you not, especially dealing with kids, how do you not let it emotionally get to you and take that home with you?
That's very difficult. And I was at Harborview for 5 years. The nursing turnover in the ER at Harborview is 2 years.
Yeah.
Because it's tragedy after tragedy rolling through the door. And
you're seeing people on their worst day every day, nonstop.
Yeah. And it's tragedy. And the worst thing in the world is walking into a room with parents and telling them your child died. You know?
Yeah.
We fished him out of Lake Washington face down, but he died.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's just heart-wrenching. And so after 5 years of that, I had to leave because it gets to you.
It does. It's inevitable. It's just a matter of how long you can maintain it. So it's very rare for people to stay in that field for a long, long time, it sounds like. Because it's just...
Or if they do, they move into an academic echelon where they're not actually dealing one-on-one with the patients quite so intensely. But I was right there on the front line. I do remember there were twin girls who had both sustained severe burns because of a kerosene heater. They were an immigrant family who had come from Mexico, I believe. Are we okay?
Yeah, we're good. I was double checking, make sure it's still recording.
Okay. Had come from Mexico. They were itinerant farm workers in the Walla Walla area. And they had a kerosene heater. Anyway, the girls had somehow knocked that over and it burned the place down. And they both sustained fairly severe burns. And I just worked with those girls day and night and worked through a translator with the parents. And probably 8 years later, I was on a vacation in the Walla Walla area with my family and happened to see those two girls go walking down the sidewalk on the main street of Walla Walla. And I remember just thinking, oh, that's great to see them living their lives. They both had some scarring left, but not super bad. They had a lot of skin grafts. And
I guess that's how you get through it, is you think about the lives that you
the successes. Yeah, that's correct. So there were so many moments that reminded me that I was in the right place doing the right thing. One of those was in residency. A woman who was my senior resident when I was an intern. We had a 3-year...
She's above you or below you?
She was above me. Okay. Yeah. She was 2 years my senior. And we were on the oncology ward that month. And there was a 3-year-old named Chris who had...
In fact, you still remember his name.
Leukemia. He had leukemia. And we got to the end of all the protocols available. And, you know, it was... And in those days, there was no such thing as a phlebotomy team or an IV line team. We did all of the IVs for the children. And I had spent like an hour looking over this kid because all of the veins were gone. You know, the vincristine and all of the meds that they used for chemotherapy at that time destroyed veins. So you started out with the nice big veins, and then you started looking for smaller and smaller places. And anyway, at that point, he was weeping, his mom was weeping, and she just said, "Let's let him go. Let's not torture him anymore. We got to let him go. And that just drove a spike through my heart. And my senior resident took my pager, which was a great sacrifice in those days. For 2 hours, she took my pager. She said, go outside, go for a walk. Cincinnati Children's Hospital is right next door to the Cincinnati Zoo. And she said, go to the zoo, walk around, look at the animals. Just forget about this for 2 hours. So I did that. And I've never forgotten that kindness that she offered to be able to get away.
They're just saying it's not personal, but everything we do is personal.
Oh, absolutely.
We're dealing with humans. And that's a field where it's like, I've thought about this where anytime you have a job where you're dealing with a uniform, you kind of have to become a different version of yourself.
Right.
I was a soldier, so if you're an elite soldier, Rangers, Special Forces, Delta, Navy SEAL, you're asked to do things that you shouldn't really normally be doing. But there's a price to pay to do those things.
Yes.
But then for police officers, people in the medical field, anyone basically that has a uniform, you have to become a different version of yourself. But that doesn't mean you don't take it home with you.
Oh, that's right. You do take it home with you.
You do. And
but I was very fortunate. My first month on as an intern, which is the first year of the 3-year residency. I should tell you first, we were on call 36 hours, off 12, on 12, off 12, 36 hours on, off 12. So every third night, we didn't sleep.
What's the medical field knows that lack of sleep is terrible.
It is, and
especially
they have
decision making.
They have since, revised that. I think people are on 18 hours at the most now,
which
maybe
is
24.
Still not great for.
Yeah. You don't want to be that medical decision that they're making at hour 23 and a half. But in the old mentality from the 40s and 50s was you're missing half the good cases by wanting to sleep,
Sleep when you're dead.
Well, yeah, sleep when you're dead. People used to ask me, it's such a long time to be a doctor. Are you really wanting to do that? And I'd say, first off, I'd be doing something with my life at that point. I might as well be learning a skill that I want to keep for a lifetime.
Yeah.
And secondly, I'm going to live my 60s now. And then when I hit 59, then I'm going to go back and live my 20s.
Do you feel like that has been somewhat true for you?
Yeah.
Nice.
I was able to do that. So that's good. Anyway, I always took my guitar with me when I was on call. I kept a guitar at the hospital. And my first month of internship, I was on the adolescent ward. And there was a guy named Chuck Pease who was...
The fact that you still remember all these names is... 14
at the time. And he had cystic fibrosis. And in those days, cystic fibrosis was a killer. It still is a serious illness. But first of all, we've been able to identify genetically who might be at risk. And that makes a difference in how many kids are actually born with it. And secondly, the treatments have gotten so much better. Mucolytics really make a huge difference. So anyway, the night that Chuck died, his mother was there, and he asked me to go get my guitar and sing him some songs. So I did. And he, at one point, turned to me and he said, Rap, because that's my initials, and so people have always called me that. Rap, keep doing what you're doing. And keep playing music because it's good. And he rolled over and died.
Wow. You've probably seen so much death. And you still have a sweetness about you that it's like, it's not normal. Usually if someone experiences one tragedy, they got to go to therapy for the next 50 years because of that one. But the amount of trauma that you've been exposed to, how did you keep your sanity?
I talked to God about it. God and I are tight.
He's your therapist?
Yeah, God is my therapist.
And And he was free. You didn't have to pay.
Yeah. There you go. And always there, too. Always available.
On call 24/7.
Yeah, yeah. I had a note card. I think I sent it to somebody not too long ago, but it was a quote from a Jesuit priest. It said something like, being holy is just being who you are. Mm. And so I figured out early on in my career that holding in the tragedy was not going to work. That didn't mean that I had to talk about it with my family, or talk about it with a friend, talked about it with God. That seemed to get it up and out so that it didn't stay inside me and create that decay that I see so many people in medicine suffering from, towards the end of their careers especially. So, yeah. Anyway, after the 5 years at Harborview, and I loved doing teaching and research. I had 1 year I had 9 papers published in the medical literature, and one of those papers went to the plenary session at the American
Remember what your
Pediatric.
Papers were on?
What's that?
What was the subject of
most of my research was leave the kids alone. One of the biggest studies that I did was looking at temperature curves in kids with burns, because what would routinely happen is a child with a 50% total body surface area burn would spike a fever to 102 in the middle of the night. And they would call the surgical intern, who was, supposed to be taking care of those folks. And the surgical intern would say, get a CBC and a blood culture, and we'll check him in the morning. Well, this happened night after night. So finally I decided, and I looked in the literature, and nobody had ever documented, the TBSA versus the height of the fever. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that all kids with a burn of 40% TBSA or more will spike fevers. And the bigger, from 40% to say 70%, the fevers go much higher. So by documenting that, I was able to get the surgical interns out of the practice of stick the kid again in the middle of the night, doing more invasive testing. So that was kind of the nature of most of that. But 1 year I produced 9 papers. One of them went to the plenary session at the national meeting for ambulatory pediatricians. And at the end of that year, I went in for my annual review with the department head, who was at Children's Hospital. And he just looked at me and said, well, all of this is nice, but you haven't brought in your whole salary on grant money. And at that point I thought, and I stopped and looked ahead at the people in my department, and nobody was happy. And I said to myself, life's too short to go through this and be miserable for my whole career. So I decided to leave Harborview, leave academia, and I went into private practice on the east side, right across the street from Evergreen Hospital in Kirkland, where I stayed for 27 years.
Let me pause you on that transitional point. I think you bring up a good point. I did a podcast with another lady. She's a licensed independent clinical social worker. And we talked about her early adult life. And as she looks back on it, she's like, I felt like a lot of the decisions that I made were on autopilot, because that's what everyone else did.
Right.
She was a smart lady. Got her master's, I think, by the time she was 21. Just on this career path. But then as she looks back on it, she's like, I just did things because that's what you were supposed to do.
Right.
But you had the awareness to sit where you're at and to see, if I continue down this path, I'll end up like these people. And I don't want to be like those people. So what do I need to do that's different? So that was interesting that it just sounds like throughout your whole life, starting at age 4, or not younger, you've always just been a critical thinker.
Yeah,
that's
I guess so.
Part of it, probably your parents, maybe, I don't know.
My mother.
And part of it, I think, is innate. And so then it's like, well, how much of it can be taught? And I think that's an answer I'll be looking for throughout this whole podcast. However long, how many years I do this podcast. I mean, I plan on doing this for the rest of my life, just engaging with people.
Fun.
and wrestling through these questions and with different types of people. But you've always just had the ability to critically think through things. Or most people, the easier way is to just follow the flow of what everyone else is doing.
Right. Yes, I guess that's probably correct, that I have always been able to be a critical thinker.
And a lot of times people, when they're naturally good at something, they may not always realize that their skill at it is not normal, and that other people, it would be much harder for them to get the same results that you do.
Yeah.
And people say it about me, and I'm just like, it just seems natural to want to talk to other human beings. They're like, no,
I get
not. And you're like, that doesn't make sense, because like anyone could do this. And they're like, no, most people can't just sit down and hold a conversation with a complete stranger for several hours on end.
Right.
I think my longest was 4 hours.
Oh, wow.
And again, I didn't know that guy. He did most of the talking, and that's part of it. It's just, I'm not doing the talking, the guest is. But can I keep that guest engaged? Do I look like I'm interested? Do I care? And I guess that stuff, just not everyone has that ability to hold the conversation.
Yeah.
But you make it easy because, A, you are very articulate. You have a lot of knowledge. So I'm just trying to pick your brain.
Yeah. I'm thinking about things that we are naturally good at. A lot of my professors in med school said I should go into psychiatry. Because to me, that's just innate.
Yeah.
The ability to pick out what's the problem, where's the glitch, what's the block. And I thought to myself, but I do that naturally. And if I chose that as a career path, I'm not going to learn very much.
Yeah.
So, and I chose a field, as I said, I chose pediatrics because it was more in-depth, but you're also dealing with the whole body.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to just think about hearts or just think about lungs.
And there's again, I do listen to a lot of medical podcasts, partly because I'm interested in not so much, there's the term longevity or biohacking. And what I'm more interested in, I don't necessarily need to live to 120. That's not my goal. What I'm more interested in is how can I have a high quality of life for as long as possible.
Right.
That's my goal. And there's different theories out there. You have this one doctor out of Harvard and you can correct me and push back on things that I've learned, because again, I'm not a doctor. This is just me as an average person trying to listen to people that way smarter than me hash through this. So there's one field where they're more about calorie restriction, limiting protein, limiting mTOR, because they just feel like, hey, there was this mouse study and we saw if restricted calories, they lived longer. And it's like, I'm not a mouse. I'm way more complicated than a mouse. So that's like one field. And I never seriously thought about making that way, but there is there's just a group of people that really are big into limiting calories, fasting, all this other stuff. And
intermittent fasting is a fad right now.
Yeah. Then I encountered people like Dr. Peter Attia, Dr. Gabriella Lyon, where they're like, of all the organs in your body, the one that you can influence the most, and again, this is just simplifying the problem. Every problem is complex, but you have to simplify it for yourself or else you won't make any decision. So they're like, hey, the one organ you can affect that they believe has the most impact is your muscle.
Okay.
And so you can grow your muscle, you can make your muscle stronger. There's all these things you can do to enhance your muscle. And oh, by the way, exercise seems to be a solution for a lot of the issues that people face. So it has multiple benefits. And so that's the center. She calls it, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon calls it muscle-centric health. And again, you don't have to necessarily take steroids to get massive muscles.
No.
But if you can actually build your muscle and you stimulate your muscle over a long period of time, for years and years on end, that can generally lead to a higher quality of life. Yeah. And so that's the path I've chosen. I did dabble into the fasting world 3 years ago. If you would have met me, I was 20 pounds overweight. And age 28 to 33, I could just, looking back, realize my health declined. I had my first major surgery. Oh. And so after that, like the progression of a lot of men, especially if they were athletes beforehand, their health just declines.
Right.
And I was still active, but not realizing that I was adding on the fat pounds. And so I went from 150 to just over 170. Then you could blame COVID and, you know, the gyms were closed and all that stuff.
Right.
I remember looking at the mirror and being like, if this is aging, I don't want any part of what's going on now because this sucks. The past 5 years has not been enjoyable. So that's what made me research all this stuff. And then I was like, so I figured out how to lose weight, now I'm down to, I weighed myself today 150. But
Good.
Initially when I lost all that weight, I did it through fasting. Okay. And when you watch all the fasters and all those doctors, one thing they tell you is you don't lose muscle.
Right.
And you're like, that is not true because I definitely lost a lot of muscle.
Right.
I went from 170 to 140 over like 5 months. And half of that was probably muscle. Because I remember looking in the mirror and be like, yeah, I lost some fat. I lost a bunch. So then I went and built some muscle out of that. But
yeah.
Yeah, and that's, I think for the average human being, sometimes it can be confusing because there's so many, I know people like to use the word misinformation. I just would say there's different viewpoints on stuff. I would say like, hey, if you want to be vegan, cool. Just realize that there are trade-offs to that.
Right.
If you want to minimize your protein intake because you saw some research that showed that was beneficial, I'm not going to call that misinformation, but I am going to say if you're limiting your protein, by the way, your organs need protein.
Yes.
And so when you eat, because there's people out there that say you only need 30 to 40 grams of protein a day. And you're just like, okay, if you want to live that life, just know that when you eat that protein, it goes to your organs first. Right. It doesn't even have time to get to your muscles.
To your muscles.
And then if you are not eating enough protein, guess where it's going to get it from? Your muscles are going to, your organs are going to steal it from your muscle. So if you want to live that life, if you want to not have a very active life, if you want to live very sedentary, then go ahead and do those decisions. But a lot of times people, they don't think through, if I go down this path, what is the likelihood of whatever outcome I want. But sorry, that was a little tangent. But let's talk about you getting into your private practice. And then me having 4 kids, obviously I'm interested in that. And one topic I do want to discuss is childhood obesity.
Childhood obesity.
Yeah, it is a big thing. And the reason why I care about it, I want to be a good example for my kids, and thankfully they're all healthy and whatnot, but I find that their peers aren't. And so I saw how much of it, maybe we'll get into this now. I saw how much work it took for me to lose weight. How much, especially, I did the fasting route, and then this past winter, I was like, okay, I'm going to lose 5 pounds of fat. And it took work.
Yes.
Right? And you're putting yourself at a deficit. Losing fat through deficit was much healthier than losing fat through fasting.
Correct.
Because when I did it through fasting, your body's like, you're not eating? Cool. We're just going to take it from everything.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay. So I wouldn't recommend that for kids.
Right.
Because they're trying to grow. And if you're not giving your body any nutrients, then how's it supposed to grow? You know? And so when I did it through the deficit, for me, it affects my sleep. I don't sleep as well.
Right.
And then your performance isn't as good. Right. So it is hard to lose fat.
Yes, it is.
I get that now, having done it. And it's like, now I see why most people who are overweight would probably like to lose weight, but the amount of effort it takes.
Yeah. Is just beyond a lot of people.
Yeah. Just for me to lose that 5 pounds over 4 months, like that was a lot of work. And for me, I could aesthetically see the difference.
Right.
That's somewhat motivating.
Right.
Where most people, you lose 5 pounds, it's like you don't even see the benefit.
Right.
So this is a question. Let me get to my question, and then I'll let you talk. So I saw how much work it took me, but now that there's so many overweight kids, how can they easily or effectively lose weight? Because there's so many kids that are overweight now. Yeah. Do they have to do the deficit like I did, or is there another way for them to do it that's not as difficult?
I always encouraged my patients to become more active. Take on a new sport, take on a new regular activity, go into the gym with their parents. I also challenged them to eat fast food only once a week or maybe 3 times a month.
So just in the lifestyle without counting the calories.
Yeah.
Did you see that make a difference in some of these kids' lives?
I did. because counting calories for children is almost impossible. It doesn't work. So much of it is dependent on our innate metabolism. Some people are slow burners and some people are quick burners. I had an MA who was from the Philippines, and she could eat 3 plates at every potluck that we ever had at the clinic and never gain an ounce. And I thought to myself, if I ate that much, on a routine basis, I'd weigh 100 pounds more than I do.
Is there a way to... Okay, so here's another question for you. Should we view kids as mini adults, or should we view them as a totally separate system?
They are a totally separate system, because both physically because of the growth factor, and mentally because, again, the brain is growing and
which is why the deficit probably isn't a good route, because kids need nutrients.
Yes.
Kids probably shouldn't be in a deficit because they're actively growing. Now that I'm adult, I can plan these deficits in because I'm not necessarily growing.
Because you're not growing.
And I can plan it, and I can understand the pain. I can understand the mental anguish. I don't like seeing my kids sick. Yeah. And I saw how much self-discipline it took for me to lose all that weight.
Right.
And I wasn't even obese.
Yeah. Our first day of internship, the chief resident sat us down before we went to the wards and said, the first thing you're going to learn, and one of the most important things you're going to learn in your 3 years here, is children are not just mini adults. They are an entirely different system with different needs. And that's why I would tell people, quit the fast food and exercise. And it worked for most of the kids. It really worked.
I think a lot of nowadays also kids probably eat too much snacks and sugary food.
Yeah.
Or if they just stick to protein food,
right,
that would probably help.
Right. In my day and age, when I was growing up as a child, we weren't allowed to have any food at 4 o'clock in the afternoon because it would spoil our dinner.
Right.
And that was really true. The whole snack culture of America came into being in the 80s, when people started to think about children as a separate entity from adults. And, oh, gosh, they're going through their glucose a little faster, so maybe they need a morning snack and an afternoon snack. We never had that. Right. We had 3 meals a day, and that was it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway. Yeah, let's see. So we got through to private practice, right? And I wore Birkenstocks in those days, and I would sit down on the floor with the parents if they were on the floor with a toddler, and talk to them. And I told them, you can call me Ruthann, you can call me Rap, you can call me Dr. P.
Just not Ruth.
Just not Ruth, yeah. But you can call me Dr. Parrish, whatever feels comfortable to you is fine with me.
Let me pause you there. I think some doctors get so caught up in the DR, in the title, and it's just like, dude, you're just a human being who has more experience or knowledge in one particular field.
Yeah.
But some people, just like anyone, like in the military, if you become a sergeant or an officer and you hide behind the title, it's like, dude, you're just a human being. And like one thing that I do in the sauna is I treat every person the same. A, you're usually not in there with a whole lot of clothing. You're in there with shorts. At the Y, they don't wear clothes, some of the dudes. It's like, dude, just put something on. Yeah. Right? But that is the cool thing of the sauna. It's like, I don't even know, because you don't. A lot of times you can know someone's status based off of their jewelry, their clothing. Right. Or when they're coming in, you could be a millionaire. I have no idea, because you're just there in shorts. So I just try to treat everyone the same, whether you're whatever you are. Yep. But yeah, those people that hide behind their whatever certification they have, it's like, dude, you're just a human being with a little bit more knowledge.
I always walked into the exam room assuming that the parent that I was going to be talking to had a double PhD. And so I would start out, mostly by listening, rather than trying to talk so much, and helping people sort of solve their own problems. If people talk enough, they kind of come around to their own solution most of the time, with behavioral problems with children anyway. And so that was often the technique that I used. But I didn't think about it. It wasn't a mental plan. Yeah. It was just, that's the way the conversation went. So,
when you started your private practice, was that risky, stressful, scary moment? Because now you're breaking away from...
Well, yeah, it was. I mean, I was grieving academia a little bit and grieving the loss of teaching, although I did for the next 10 years teach 1 month a year on the teaching house service at Children's Hospital. So 1 month out of the year, I was going over to Children's in the morning and in the office in the afternoon. And that kept me in touch with, the latest, kept me in touch with the residents, the med students. It was funny. I had a hearing issue a while back, and had to see a specialized ENT doctor. And he walked into the room and he looked at me and he said, "Dr. Parrish?" And I said, "Oh yeah, you were one of my students. You were a third-year student in 1990 whatever." Yeah. And he said, "Yeah." I said, "You can call me Ruthann now." He said, No, you'll always be Dr. Parrish to me. You're the attending." It was just kind of funny. Yeah. Anyway, it was scary because I was doing something new, but at the same time, it was people. And helping people was what I'd always wanted to do with medicine. So that part didn't change.
So what was that like starting your own practice?
I realized that I needed to focus much more on the well child visit, WCC. So I really sat down for about a year and thought about that. And I wrote up what I called report cards for each of the visits, the regular checkups, the 1 month, the 2, 4, 6, 9, 12 month visit, the 15, the 18, the 2 year, and then yearly. And wrote up a report card, which included things that the parents could do to be stimulating development at certain ages, some reading material for them, some of the basic, most important issues about development for that particular age, and parents loved those. I did those for the whole time I was in private practice. After 27 years on the East Side, where I dealt largely with the worried well, there were a couple of meetings with the group that was then known as Pediatric Associates, and is now called Allegro Pediatrics, and they wanted every visit to go to 10 minutes. And I stood up in a meeting and said, you can't deal with a depressed teenager in 10 minutes. Right. You just cannot do it. And so then they came to me and said, "We think we should part company." I said, "Oh, okay." Yeah. I'm one of your most productive physicians, but ignoring that, okay.
So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
The person who was pushing for the 10-minute thing.
Yeah.
Was that someone on the admin side or an actual doctor that was like, yeah?
He was both.
So why would...
Because it was more money.
I understand the money part, but like a doctor who has... Because I can understand... Here's my issue with academia. Is I like a practitioner that has done both academia and worked with real life people.
Right.
Because then you have real life skills,
right,
qualities. It's kind of like you know who Dr. Jordan Peterson is? Mm-hmm. And whether you like him or not, what I appreciate about him is very high IQ.
Yeah.
Right. Can articulate well, whatever his position is. But I respect the fact that he's actually worked with real patients.
Yes.
Where a lot of people in academia, oh, I looked at this study, I read this book, I read that. But it's like, but have you ever sat down with a client and helped them fix their problem?
Right.
And it's like, well, no.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, well, this guy, he's had however many decades of working with clients and getting them to do whatever obstacle they've had, help them overcome that.
Right.
So I'm always looking, when I try to find my people that I like to listen to, that's what I look for is, do you only have academia knowledge, which is useful, right? But do you also have practical real world situation where you've helped people in whatever field?
Right. Yeah,
and
makes sense.
Especially when I'm getting health advice from a doctor, and Joe Rogan says this, he's like, if you're trying to get lifestyle advice from a doctor, first look at the doctor who's giving you the advice. If he is extremely out of shape, overweight, maybe don't get lifestyle advice from him.
Right.
And, if it's for something else like non-lifestyle, like I don't care if you weigh 500 pounds, if you can fix my broken arm. Cool.
Yeah, right.
But if you're trying to give me lifestyle advice and you aren't even following through with that,
better be walking the talk.
Then I'm less inclined to listen to you on that information.
Absolutely. So at that point, I moved from private practice on the east side with the Worried Well to the community health clinic in Snohomish County. I was the clinic director for the North Clinic, which is on Broadway, just before you get to the Trestle, before you get to
I'm assuming that was
Community College.
For you probably, money was never your main point.
No.
And that's another thing I've thought about a lot is I believe in businesses making money. But some fields, you cannot put profit over people.
Right.
And for me, those fields are ones, every business at some point does interact with the human being, right? So then it's like, where do you draw the line? Where it's like, well, in the medical field, if everything's nonprofit, then the incentive structure is not there for people to work hard.
Right.
Right. But if everything is highly for profit, then the incentive structure then is people are just in the way of making money.
It's a meat market. Yeah.
So it's trying to find that balance where it's like, and I have this conversation with people on the sauna all the time. It's like, unfortunately, Boeing is a big company around here. And it's like, unfortunately, because they're both in the stock market, we pit Meta against Boeing. And it's like, if Meta messes up Facebook and their code's off, no one's really dying.
Right.
If Facebook doesn't work tomorrow, it's like, cool, it didn't work. But if Boeing messes up, people die.
Right.
But they're graded the same. What was your quarterly profits? And so in the medical field, we need to do better with our incentive programs. Because I need the doctor to make money. I need the nurses to make money. I need them to actually have a high quality of life.
Right.
But at the same time, we still got to figure out how to take care of the customer. And I know other countries have universal health care. My brother-in-law lives in Canada, but he's like, good luck trying to get service. Yeah. It's free, but you could be dead by the time you get your appointment.
Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
That's not something we're going to solve today, but definitely something I think through.
No, but I will say that the trend towards bigger and bigger corporations owning and running medical facilities in this area, and I think across the country, is not a good trend.
No.
Optum, for instance, bought the Everett Clinic.
Yeah.
And, so they've got middle-level managers who are depending on the doctors producing so many patients per day.
Would you say those mid-level managers were prior doctors? Were they admin?
They're admin.
So they don't even know.
They don't even know what they're saying when they say, well, just have the doctor see 2 more patients a day.
Right. Because you can do that if you're dealing with technology. Right.
Yeah.
Then it is, how efficient can you get that algorithm? Yeah. How efficient? But like, humans don't work that way.
Right. And I've always said, any doctor, no matter how good they are, no matter what field they're in, has about 30 good medical decisions that they can make in a day.
Yeah.
And beyond 30, they're not going to be as good at decisions.
Yeah, decision fatigue.
Right.
Or a computer doesn't have decision fatigue.
Correct.
It just needs power.
My biggest day of seeing patients ever, I saw 56 patients in one day. And I was absolutely drained at the end of the day. I was, by that time, running 20 minutes behind, which my patients were not used to. And one of the dads said, because he brought his 2 daughters in with earaches at 8:25 in the evening, and he said something about, wow, we've had to wait a long time. And I said, I'm sorry, but your daughters are number 55 and 56 that I've seen today. And quite honestly, I probably ran out of good decision making 20 decisions ago. But I will see them and we'll do for them what we can.
Let me ask you this. Yeah. Having dealt with thousands of patients at this point, especially with kids, my wife and I, we we don't take our kids to the doctor that often because we just always had the mentality of like, most likely it'll just work itself out. We actually did recently take our kid to the ER because he was complaining of, we didn't know if he had appendicitis. So as a parent, it's like, maybe he just has the stomach virus. So we're trying to ask him, where's the pain? Where's the pain? Is it here? Is it here? Yeah. And he kept hinting towards his appendix. So we're like, all right, well, we'll take him. We go, ends up being like a 6-hour ordeal. They do an ultrasound, and they only saw 50% of it, and they're like, it's fine. So then it's like, yes, we're glad we went because now we have the peace of mind that it wasn't a thing. Right. But as a parent, it's like, we erred on not taking our kids unless we thought it was a serious issue. But I think a lot of parents do take their kids when it's like, if you just waited it out, they would have been fine. Right. Percentage of cases, how many do you wish you could have just told the parent, like, your kid's fine? In the population on the east side, probably 30%. In the population I worked with at CHC, Community Health Center, no, there were not very many worried wells there. They were mostly like, hey, there was a serious issue. There was real use of real medicine. Yeah. So different population entirely. Yeah. I learned a little bit of Spanish. I speak French, so I could get by with the West African folks. And I needed a lot of interpreters for languages like Tigrinya and Mongolian and, several others I can think of. Russian, Ukrainian. I don't speak any of that. So, it was a whole different population. And it was free care to them. And primarily federally funded. I kind of shudder to think how long will that system be able to survive, given the present political climate of let's slash the budgets for everything. But there's a real need because those people, most of whom come from other countries, English is not their primary language and never will be, and they need health care for their children just as much as everybody else. So we'll see. It would be lovely to go to a single payer system. The problem in our country, one of the problems in our country for the medical care is that the insurance companies kind of took over the power from the doctors in the 90s. We could do a whole conversation on that. I've been doing a lot more research into that and just once you see how, with that guy that was just recently assassinated, that got people thinking about that more. So there's been more guests on these different podcasts talking about BMOs or BPMOs. What's the term? It's the middle guy between the insurance and they help with like the dispensing of the medication and the cost for that. Right. But yeah, you look into that whole world and it's like the incentives are not right. So we have to fix it somehow. We do have to fix it. The costs are outrageous. You see the stats of how much money America spends on the medical assistance versus every other country. Right. But we're not. If we're spending that much money, we should be a healthier nation. Yes. But all these other countries that are spending way less are on paper healthier. So we're missing something here. Yeah. We're spending all this money, but we're not as healthy. What's going on? But when you look at the numbers, we're spending about 80% of what we spend on medicine on 20% of the population. So it's not all the way across the board. I was sad when Group Health sold to Kaiser Permanente because Group Health really tried to be a closed system that offered excellent care to its patients with multiple specialties and timely care. Like your brother, you said, lives in Canada, and there, you might need
an appointment or a surgery for an aneurysm or something, and they'll put you on a list, and then they call you and say, be in the hospital in 20 minutes or your spot goes to somebody else. And it could be the same week or it could be 3 months down the line, and you never know.
I think what we need people like you who are no longer actively in the game, but could still offer their advice to fix the current system. I don't know if we'll ever get to the point, but that's what we need, I think, is people who have gone through the system who are now able to give back.
Yeah, I'd be happy to be involved
to solve
in
it
something like that
on a county level, a state level, and then a federal level. Because we have to, for the sake of our kids and our grandkids, we have to get this figured out.
That's correct.
Because it's not getting any better.
Right, and as climate warming continues, respiratory illnesses, for instance, are just going to get worse for everybody.
So yeah, talk to me about that. How is climate affecting our respiratory?
Oh, golly, the more pollution in the air. Kids, I used to see kids with asthma as soon as the fire season started in the mountains. Kids would come in with, I can't breathe. It hurts to breathe. And my medicine doesn't seem to be working anymore.
That's the tough thing, especially for ideally everyone, but for someone like myself that wants to be more conscious about their health, right? There's certain things that I can control. I can control somewhat how much body fat I have. I can control what I intake into my system. But I can't control the air pollution.
Right.
I can somewhat control the water, depending on what water I drink. But even still, there's so many other things that you can't control.
That's correct.
Like they've done this whole thing on plastics.
Yeah.
It's like it's everywhere. That it's like even if you drink out of a glass bottle, the water that came to your house through all the underground system, that was plastic.
Has plastics in it. Yeah.
Or the bottling system for the liquid you're drinking probably came from plastic. So it's like there's certain things you just can't avoid.
That's right.
You cannot avoid unless you were extremely wealthy and you can breathe in really good oxygen everywhere you went. So that's the other part. It's I control what I can, but there's so many other variables.
Yeah.
Like right now, I think it started a couple years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. My first 10 years in Washington, I didn't have a pollen issue. I moved here in 2009.
Okay.
No pollen issue. And then starting around 2020, and now I have pollen issue. And I can't control that.
Right.
I don't know what tree is killing me, but there's a tree out there that's killing me.
Already?
Yeah.
Are you feeling it already this season?
It started when it hit 60 degrees. That was like a week ago.
So it's probably the cedar pollens.
Is that what you think it is?
Because I did the same thing. I moved here in '82, and after being on east of the Mississippi for a bunch of years, and I didn't have any tree troubles until about 7-8 years after we had moved here.
So what do you think caused that?
What causes that?
Yeah.
The immune system gets sensitized to certain proteins in the air. And
do you think the pollution has a part to play in that?
Yeah, I think as more pollutants sit in the air that we breathe, it's going to irritate the respiratory system more. Sure. Yeah.
So there's 3 months of my life where I'm not sick, but I have all these symptoms of being sick, and it's just frustrating. And for someone that wants to live a healthy life, it's like, ugh.
One thing you might think about doing for yourself would be to have a one-time visit to an allergist where they do the skin testing and they can figure out exactly what your allergens are.
Because I'm a sole veteran, I get my health care through the VA.
Right.
And I actually mentioned that to my nurse, and she's like, no. I was like, why? She's like, because I have to have a reason for you to have the test. And I was like, so I know what I'm allergic to. And she's like, well, then what are you going to do with that knowledge? I was like, at least I can curse at the tree that's causing me illness, at least, right?
Right. You'll know what time of the year you need to take an antihistamine or a nasal spray or both.
Yeah. So instead, she's like, well, I'll just give you these 2 meds. But it's like, but I still want to know what it is I'm allergic to.
Sure.
So I don't know. I have to figure
that out.
And
you're going to have to push that issue. You're going to have to push that issue.
Yeah. I will next time I talk to her. I'm getting my labs done.
Yeah.
What is your And we can wrap up soon, and I'm sure you got time to
No, it's
consider.
fine. I have a 2:00 doctor's appointment, but it's right around the corner, so
Okay.
not a big deal.
What are your thoughts on the health and? Well, let's actually talk about what did you do to stay healthy. What was kind of your protocols for health and fitness in your adult life?
As a college, 3 to 5 miles a day, and I did that up until I was in my early 50s.
And that wasn't normal.
That wasn't normal?
From what I've gathered from speaking to other people your age, running back then wasn't a normal pastime activity.
Well, there was a woman, and I'm blanking on her name right now, Melissa something or other. She was an Olympic runner. She'd run the marathon and the Olympics in 68 or 72 or something. Anyway, and she kind of touted running as a good possible activity, and I thought it's probably the most efficient use of my time. I never had a lot of time to exercise, but if I could run for half an hour, I not only felt good, but kept my muscles in good shape, and I could pretty much eat what I wanted and not worry about weight issues. Genetically, the women in my family have always been heavier than normal, so I've always had to kind of keep that in mind. And so until my early 50s, I was a runner. And then I started developing some plantar neuromas on my feet and went to a podiatrist who said, well, your choices are this. You can keep running now or you can walk when you're 80. It's your choice. So at that point, I switched over to biking and would do some long distance biking. It would take longer, but if I biked for half an hour, I lived just east of the town of Woodinville along the Tolt Trail. And
they have some nice bike trails out there.
Yeah, and so I could go there and I could run and my kids could ride their bike along with me. And then when I switched to biking, they could bike along with me and we could talk and have a pleasant day in the woods and I could get some exercise.
And
so that's the kind of thing I tried to do.
At that point.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I was allergic to trees, but you gotta pick your battles. Incidentally, anytime you want more oxygen, go out into the woods because trees are the natural producers of oxygen. Anyway,
the thing that's killing me is also keeping me alive.
Yeah, that's right. So there you go. Life is a balance. And old age is not for cowards.
So let me ask you this. This is because you have a wealth of knowledge. Do you think me having these symptoms for as long as because I'm going to have these symptoms for probably 3 months.
Yeah.
Is that affecting my quality of life as I get older? Like having underlying issues for an extended period of time, that's got to be affecting me in the long term. There's got to be a price to pay for that, I think. I don't know.
It probably, because it's chronic inflammation of the whole respiratory tract. Yeah, it probably does at some point. Now, I'm in my 70s, and I have not noticed that I'm wheezing or having more trouble breathing than I did when I was in my 40s.
Yeah.
So,
and I think sometimes it's like there's this guy named Brian Johnson. Who's when you're worth 500 mil, you can do some crazy projects. So his project is don't die.
Wow.
I'm not in that camp because I think death is inevitable.
Yeah.
And so now they're like, hey, if you eat this cookie, it's going to take 2 days off your life. So they're trying to measure everything by if you do this is what it will cost you later on. And
you end up living in fear. And what fun is that?
And it's like the cigarette, I can understand if you smoke a cigarette, that's like 4 hours of your life. And so, but again, it's like, I don't know how many people, because what he needs to do, because he's in his 40s, go hang out with 100-year-olds.
Right.
And be like, oh, that's what your quality of life is at that point. So, yeah, I'm not on the whole don't die thing, but I'm just like, yeah, I want a high quality of life. And I guess if I passed away at 88 versus 89 is not that big of a deal.
Right. And meanwhile, you've lived a fun life.
Yeah.
You lived a life that has some joy.
Yeah, because he goes to bed at 8. His protocols are outrageous.
Yeah.
He goes to bed so early. His last meal of the day is at 11 a.m. Just the most ridiculous stuff.
And then gets up at 4 a.m. and yeah.
Yeah.
And some people do that and really enjoy that.
Yeah.
And if it makes them happy, more power to them.
Each their own. And what I do like about some of and the reason why I listen to him, because he's like, even if you don't have all the money I have, right? Because there's not a whole lot of people out there worth 500 mil.
500 mil.
And this is the message that I preach to people is the things you can't affect is your sleep,
yeah,
your nutrition,
yeah,
and your exercise.
Right.
Those are the 3 you do have control over, especially if you're in America. If you're in a village in Africa, then you have less agency over that. But
Correct.
If you're in America, if you're making good money, then you do have control
Correct.
over those 3 things.
Although perhaps in Africa you might have cleaner air.
Yeah, that is the one thing. Yeah.
Just depends. Just depends on exactly where you
live.
So
we're going back to you chose cardio as your main form of exercise.
Yes.
You weren't big into resistance training?
I did that for about 10 or 12 years. And for me, what it did was bulk up muscle, but it didn't particularly help with weight maintenance. So I kind of chose a little more cardio and a little less resistance. But yeah, I've done both.
Yeah, because again, I'm not a woman, but I have a wife and I have a daughter.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of nieces, and so I put a lot more research into male stuff because I'm a guy and I have 3 boys. But I do want to have some basic understanding of the female. And so there are a lot more female doctors out there now that are like, hey, a lot of these studies were just take a man and a woman is 80%.
Right.
And they're like, that's not true.
Right.
They're different systems. And so they're trying to push now and this is what I would encourage anyone, resistance training is good because it stimulates the muscle but also stimulates the bone.
Right.
Because they're finding as women get older, if they didn't do any type of resistance training, their bones end up being more brittle.
Yeah.
And so there's a phase in your life where you should probably do it your whole life, but if you can really hit it hard in your late teens into your 20s, then you can build up the stronger bone.
Right.
So that it's just stronger as you age because naturally things decay, sarcopenia, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's just what I push to everyone. It's like, you don't have to get these huge bodybuilding muscles, but can you stimulate your muscle?
Right.
And
I do my, 10 minutes of arms and light weights kind of thing to get my arms involved too, along with the biking for my legs and my heart.
I always find it interesting when I see people in the medical field that smoke cigarettes. It's like,
that never made any sense to me.
You of all people should know that it's not beneficial.
Never made any sense to me.
How many would you say, what percentage of people in the medical field had alcohol issues? Was it a lower percentage?
Yeah, I think so.
That's good. Because again, they should know as well. Like smoking and alcohol, those are the 2 things you have high control over.
Yeah, you can really control. And how TV portrays lawyers and doctors. Lawyers come home and have a whiskey every night after work and another one after dinner and, all of that. Well, I guess that's all right if that's them and they'll die in their 70s. That's okay. But the doctors, the most realistic TV show for physicians is The Pit. I don't know if you've seen that one.
I was actually going to bring that up. I did start watching that.
Yeah.
So you've enjoyed that?
Oh, yeah. It's very realistic. Yeah. It's very much the way Harborview was.
The latest episode. And I've enjoyed it. Here's what's super fun about that TV show. I'm going to probably have my kids watch it when they're a little older.
Yeah.
Because you get to see all these different experiences. The college kid that never took drugs.
Right.
Then dies because he took drug
one.
That was laced with whatever.
Fentanyl.
And then he dies. So, and then there's so many unique, interesting things that they have to face.
Right.
And here's what's super interesting is I see the episode and then I'll meet someone in real life that is dealing with that issue. And so, the one where the old guy comes in and then, his kids are there and they're like, hey, DNR and all that other stuff. And then he's about to be my tenant. His dad is literally in that position They're like, we can do dialysis, we can do all this stuff, but he's 89.
Right.
So why don't we just let him enjoy the last few months of his life?
Yeah.
We could probably keep him alive for another year or two. But
what quality?
What quality?
Yeah.
So it's just so interesting that the TV show, I think they did a really good job with that TV show. Yeah. I'm not even in the medical field, but it gets the average person thinking about these situations.
Right.
And I want my kids to watch it when they're older, because it's like, hey, if you're at a party and someone gives you, hey, don't take a drug, but definitely don't take a drug of some random other kids taking, because you had the one kid, you had two kids that took it.
Right.
The girl survived and the boy did not.
Correct.
So.
Yeah. I early on I tried to watch Grey's Anatomy because everybody was talking about it being so wonderful, and right away I realized it was less about medicine and more about soap opera with the doctors and nurses, screwing each other off in the laundry rooms and whatnot. And I thought, this is not realistic. Yeah. This has nothing to do with medicine.
Yeah, I hope the pit continues. I think the novelty will eventually wear off. So it may, I don't know how many seasons it can successfully keep
the
going.
Pit?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that either, because they've already run through so many of the common things that you see.
And some TV shows are good if they only last a season or two.
Yeah.
Once they go past 4, 5, 6, and it's like...
Well, they usually change writers.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the line, they'll change and get a whole new crop of writers in who either didn't have the original vision or just aren't as good as the
so
people
that's interesting
that started
that you've
writing
enjoyed it. But anyone that I've talked to that's watched it, they're like, oh, that's interesting. And then there's another TV show. Have you seen Severance?
No, I've not, but I've got that on my list. Is it good?
It's good in the fact that it's unique, because so many TV shows, from episode 1, you already know how it's going to go. Like a crime show, you know that here's the bad guy.
Right.
And so Severance is unique in that it doesn't follow that arc.
Okay.
But, earlier in our conversation, we were talking about how when you're a doctor, you come across so many, I forget what word you use, traumatic trauma related issues. And so the whole premise of Severance is your work life doesn't know your personal life, and your personal life doesn't know your work life.
Oh, okay.
And so that's the premise. And then you can decide if you want to watch it from there. And they're more or less knocking the 9-to-5 job. People go to their work. Most people hate their 9-to-5, and they just want to forget it.
Right.
And then they go off work, then they just focus on their personal life. So that's kind of like the whole premise of it, is knocking the 9-to-5.
Okay.
But yeah, in the real world, your personal life does affect your work and vice versa.
Right.
But yeah, it's interesting you like the Pit. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah.
Too, and my kids will watch it.
Yeah. And, other Chicago Med, again, is more soap opera than about medicine, really. The Good Doctor, I watched a few episodes, and it was kind of interesting, but again, it wasn't much of a challenge diagnostically. House was interesting from the previous decade, but it got so way out. Things, Chimera syndrome, you're never going to see that in your whole life. But, they focused on the very weirdities of the weirdities on that show. So
a few last questions for you.
Yeah.
For someone that is interested in getting in your field, I did a little research, and I saw that there's only 58,000 pediatricians nationwide, which to me doesn't seem like a lot, especially
Correct.
with how many kids there are.
Right.
It seems like the medical field in general, there just aren't enough people getting into it.
Correct.
And then the people that are retiring are getting replaced at a high level.
Pediatrics is the lowest paid specialty.
Oh, is that why?
Yeah, and that's a large part of it, because, well, in general, our country does not prioritize children, which is a huge mistake.
Right,
because the future is children. We should have free daycare for kids. We need more resources into education for kids. And if we had those things, and counseling for the kids that live in a life of trauma. People don't know how many children go home and they're afraid they're going to get beaten that night because they didn't eat their turnips, and they don't like turnips. That kind of thing. So in general, our society just needs to be putting more emphasis on children and the future. It's not a big surprise that pediatrics is the lowest paid specialty. My housemate is a pediatric speech language pathologist. They are the lowest paid of any group of speech path people for any age group. There's lots of money for the people that want to work with stroke victims in their 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
But not much money for the kids that are having articulation and stammering issues now.
Which will then affect them for the rest of their lives if they can improve their speech.
That is correct.
Versus an 80-year-old, it's like...
Well, yeah, communication is key. I mean, that's what you're doing here. So anyway, as a general rule, we don't prioritize children. And so people who come out of school with $200,000 in debt are not going to go into the lowest paid specialty if they can possibly help it.
Out of line.
Time Magazine had an article a couple of weeks ago. Why can't you find a pediatrician? Well, it's because nobody's going into the specialty. When I went through school, when I finished med school, 92% of us went into a primary care specialty. We were all still remembering the speech where JFK said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And I interviewed, because of my anthropology background, I interviewed people in my own med school class. And that quote came up frequently as a reason for why people chose primary care. Now, people want an 8 to 4 job with no weekend and no call. And that's just not primary care. Kids get sick at 2 o'clock in the morning, as you well know.
Yeah.
And so it's practically impossible. I don't know what's going to happen to the field of pediatric medicine. Our poor choice for Health and Human Services secretary at the moment is not helping the situation. And until people realize that kids are important for the future, not much is going to change. I tried to do all the teaching that I could. I had med students come to my office in all of my years at CHC, and I felt like I did a pretty good job of instilling in them pediatrics as an important field. You need to think about going into this. You're not going to get paid as much as if you went into thoracic surgery, but you're also probably not going to have the stresses that come with, I just operated on a patient who died on the table.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard not to get sad and depressed thinking about the current situation. But let's talk about some of the cases that you knew you made a difference in someone's life, or you saved their life, so people can hear that and be like, oh, okay, that's why it was worthwhile.
Yeah.
It wasn't just the money. I know you shared some with the girls in the burn.
Yeah. As I told you, I took my guitar with me to work, or I kept one at the hospital. And on the nights when I was on call, if things got quiet around 3:30 in the morning, I would go to the neonatal nursery and sing and play for the nurses and the babies. And you could kind of see them relax. These little tiny people, in an incubator, you could see them just kind of settle out. In Cincinnati at that time, there was no other children's hospital within a 150-mile radius all the way around. And so we would go pick up babies from the border of West Virginia and bring them back to Cincinnati, which is clear at the other end of the state. And the ambulance drivers always hoped that I was on call, because they liked to sing too, and it took us 2 hours to get there to the baby and then 2 hours to bring them back. So for the 2 hours it took to get to the baby, we'd sing, me and Bobby McGee and all those old country folk type songs, and they thought that was splendid.
So from what I gather, again, we just met, we've talking almost 2 hours.
That's okay.
You seem to you were not the norm in your field.
No, I was not the norm in my field.
And we need more people like you that have a heart. And I think the music, like, I'm not musically inclined, but I appreciate, like, my best friend is the exact opposite of me. He's an artist, a musician, a creative type. And I look at those people, and it's like the ability just to create out of thin air is like magic to me.
Right.
And it's so necessary, but it's just hard to scientifically say, if you do this, right? Because when you're science-based, you want to know what is the mechanism of action, right? But with music, it's just like, well, you just do it, and it has a positive impact, right?
Yeah.
And
although music and math, there's a lot of relationship there.
Yeah. And so for you, you were able to, because you are good at so many different things, you're able to see the value in multiple different fields, and then bring them to who you are. And hopefully, and I know it sounds like you try to make a difference in people coming up, and hopefully you were able to create other mini yous and had an impact, because we need more people like that. Again, you probably missed out on making some more money, but I don't think most people, if they're on their deathbed, wish they would have made more money.
No, you can't take it with you.
Probably most of them wish they could have maybe spent more time with their family, or made a bigger impact on society, and I think you did. And so, again, I appreciate what you've done, just from talking to you, and I hope we can make more doctors like you.
I think more doctors who have an emphasis on the right brain and the left brain will make a difference, because the right brain is the creative side, the if you will, the people side. The left side is the I read this study and this is what it said side, and the critical thinking. But you have to have a balance of both, I think, to be a successful physician and also just to be a successful human being. So this that you are doing is your creative side.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Few last questions. So this podcast is called The Game of Life.
Okay.
And so if you can summarize, sentence, phrase, whatever, but to you, life is ...
Life is an adventure. Life is fascinating. And at the moment that I leave this life, I know I'm going to want to say, if I can say anything at all, I'm going to want to say thanks for all of it, because it's just an experience not to be missed. And I think if you love people and you're willing to serve people, you'll always be a good doctor. Beyond that, I think you gotta say what you're thinking, say what you're feeling. If you love somebody, tell them. Whoever said, I heard I love you too many times? Yeah, nobody. It's imperative that we feel the love, that we acknowledge the love, that maybe we even look at the blocks to love, but that we share, that we create community, that we create children who are loving and confident. I used to tell parents, our children remember 40% of what we say, 70% of what we do, and 100% of how we made them feel. And so if you can keep in mind as a parent every minute, how am I making this child feel right now? And if it seems like I'm harping on something or I'm making them feel bad, then stay connected, but let them talk. Let them tell you how they're feeling. And then you can figure out, well, it wasn't really something I said that made them feel that way. It's because their best friend dissed them on the playground today, whatever. But you can explore that. When my kids were teenagers, my daughter especially, my son was easy in the teen years, my daughter not so much. She'd say, oh, you're really dumb. And I'd say, oh, it's so interesting that you say that. Tell me more. And not respond.
You could have taken it personal and said, I'm
you don't take it personally. You don't argue back, because again, your frontal cortex is a whole lot more mature than the child's, and so you just listen to what they're feeling, and you can work it through with them if you know. But if you shut them down and you never know what they were feeling, then yeah, that's a chink in the armor. That's a bit of a break in the communication. And helping children become who they were created to be, and helping them learn to listen to themselves is a really important skill. And parents can give that to their children if they're willing to listen.
I like it.
So, yeah.
Again, you sound like someone that's always learning.
That's what?
Always learning.
Yeah, hope so.
And so this question may be a little hard for you to answer, but because I ask people, what is something you learned as you got older in life that you wish you would have understood when you were younger? Again, I don't ask people if they have regrets, but knowledge that you've learned older that would have been helpful for your younger self or to other younger people.
Wow, that one's tough.
Like for me, as you're thinking about that, I was always an athlete, but it wasn't until my 30s that I really understood calories, fat, muscle, how my body worked.
Yeah.
And had I understood that better in my 20s, I could have been a way better athlete. I just didn't understand that whole part.
Okay.
And that's something that affects everyone. Now, like when my kids, they're athletes, I would be able to scientifically help them way better than I just went and did the thing, but I didn't understand the science behind it.
Right.
But now in my 30s, and I talk to men now in their 30s and 40s, they don't understand. So it's hard to attain at something when you don't even know how to go about that. Because I'll ask dudes in the sauna, and this is in the gym where people are actively trying to be better. Where I ask them, like, how do you actually lose weight or gain fat? And most people don't know. And so that was something that I literally spent 3 years on this journey of learning and always learning.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned something earlier in our conversation. You don't really know something until you can explain it to someone else.
Right.
So I had a moment in the sauna. Dude, I love my sauna time. I had a moment in the sauna a few weeks ago where this guy came in, and I, like what you said, tell people, especially if it's positive, say that to them. So if a guy comes in and he actually looks good, if someone's overweight, I'm not going to be like, oh, you look fantastic.
Yeah.
I don't believe in lying to someone.
No.
But this guy looked really good. And I was like, hey, man, you look really good. He's like, oh, I really appreciate that because I've been putting a lot of effort into it the past 2 months. And so guys generally don't compliment other guys.
Right.
And then that led to a whole conversation where he lost weight through the fasting route.
Oh, okay.
And I was like, dude, I just went through that. And so we had this amazing conversation. And then I was able to add on to that because I was like, look, there's different phases. There's maintenance phase, there's a bulk phase, there's a deficit phase. But if you indefinitely stay in the deficit phase, it will start being detrimental.
Right.
And he was coming to that point where it's like, hey, now you're actually at a really good spot. If you continue what you're doing, you're actually start losing your muscle.
Eat your body. Yeah.
And so he was, after that whole conversation, he's like, wow, thank you so much. You just changed my life.
Yeah.
I'm not even a doctor. And so that was really cool because it's like, wow, I really understand this stuff now because now I'm able to explain it to someone else in such a way that they can take action on it. Yeah. Not that I know everything. I'm not a doctor, but I was able to apply it to my life. Now I want to share it. And it's like, and I always tell people, like, go research it for yourself, right? Hopefully I was able to at least point you in the right direction so that you can be like, oh, maybe this guy doesn't know what he's talking about and he's full of junk, or he knows a little bit of something to, go learn more. Right. I don't care if someone has an opposing view on me. That's fine. Just know why you have an opposing view.
Right. I guess what I would do now that I didn't do so much in my 20s was listen. I would listen more to people. I think in every human being, there's a spark of creativity. And it, as we've pointed out in this conversation, manifests itself in many, many different ways in different fields. But I think that it's there in everybody. And I just, the only regrets that I really have are the times when I was rushed out of a conversation with a patient parent because of time constraints, and I got two more people waiting in waiting rooms to go see. And if I'd had the time to just listen to them, I think I could have helped point that out to them. This is a place where you can be creative. Because I think creativity comes from God.
I have a couple more questions. We'll end at some point because we could probably talk for a very long time.
Hours and hours. Yeah.
So here's a topic I've been thinking about a lot, and it's emotional regulation.
Okay.
And there's the general norms that men are less emotional than women, and I don't necessarily agree with that because men are emotional. We just express it differently through anger, and frustration,
and silence.
So that is an emotion, but we a lot of times just say girls are more emotional. It's like, no, they just express it differently.
Right.
And so my question to you is this: how would you advise other women or men to? I don't want people to be less emotional. Just not let it control your behavior so much to the point where you make poor decisions.
Right.
So that's why I like to use the term emotional regulation.
Right.
And, for the reason why I say a lot of marriages have issues is because there's a lot of miscommunication, but also just it's the emotional part where like you let your emotions take over you.
Right. And you say something that you wish you hadn't said.
Yeah. And you sound like someone that has a high level degree of just critical thinking. But how does one manage their emotions to the point where it doesn't put them in a negative spot?
Well, again, I think that gets back to our earlier discussion about options. You always want to leave an interaction with another human being in a way that gives you more options for the future, if you possibly can.
For you, was it self-talk where you would talk yourself through things?
Yeah. I think that's right. I grew up, as I told you early on, my dad was a pastor in a very fundamentalist tradition. And that particular fundamentalist tradition did not really allow for emotions, didn't really acknowledge that human beings have emotions. And you were never supposed to be angry, and you were just supposed to be happy all the time. And that's not real life.
Right.
Emotions are not rational. And the sooner people get that through their thick heads, the better off we all will be.
Yeah, because there's a place for it. And like, so my oldest, he's on a basketball team. He's pretty good.
Yeah.
I'm biased, but but the thing was, it's like, hey, I want you to be emotional because I'm not a very emotional guy. And so the easy response to him being emotional would be, don't do it. But what I would much rather him do is learn to harness that emotion.
Correct.
In the middle of a basketball game where it's tense.
Correct.
Your opponent doesn't necessarily need to see your emotion. You can feel it.
Right.
And then use that as energy, hopefully positively.
Right.
Versus, as we tell most men, shut it down, which is not good.
No, you want to get the kid to channel that emotion into energy for the game. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Like I said, it comes down to options. Always try to leave yourself more options. If you have a discussion with a friend that turns into an argument, don't leave it at a place where that friendship is now negated, but try to leave options so you can discuss it at a different time when you're both cooler heads, or certainly not physical violence. That's not going to not going to serve anybody any good. And just being aware of the other person's personhood, because I think all human beings have value.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Is there a question I should have asked, or a topic we could have hit? Any last words?
I think probably I was expecting the question, what was the thing about your job you didn't like the most? And I would say it was, two things. One is just socially, when you tell somebody in a non-medical setting that you're a doctor, about 50% of people will suddenly say, oh, would you look at this mole and tell me what you think? Which at a wine and cheese party is just not where I want to go. But secondly, it was the time factor, the fact that I was always under pressure for time.
Yeah.
From 8 o'clock in the morning until 6:30 in the evening. I was being told every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes, you got to go here, you got to do this, you got to talk to this person, you got to call the lab. And so it was sort of always a frenzy of time. But that's not people. That wasn't I loved the people part, just didn't like the time constraints. And that's what I'm enjoying about retirement is I can be in charge of my own time for the first time in 40 years. I like that.
Yeah. And one thing that I enjoy about podcasts is it's a long form conversation.
Yeah.
We don't know where it's going to go. Hopefully both parties are, even if they don't like each other, and every guest we've had a cordial relationship.
Yeah.
But that's what's enjoyable because we're not constrained on time. It's not like I don't have a list of questions that I'm trying to get across.
Right.
It's just more like, hey, where's this conversation going to go?
Yeah.
And I definitely have gotten a lot out of it. And,
so I don't fault you for not asking what was the thing I didn't like the most. But that's a common question. I mean, I've talked to, high school classes and junior high classes about career day and all that sort of thing. And that question always comes up. What didn't you like about being a doctor?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but no, it's been very enjoyable. Thank you.
Yeah. Appreciate it so much.
Yeah. I hope you have many more good conversations.
Yeah, I hope so too.